Hello, Rod.
Hey, Reza, how are you?
I'm doing very well. This is the day after the New Hampshire primary, and everybody is still trying to figure out exactly what happened. I think we could start there because, we know each other a little bit through our work, but one thing that I do know about you is that you're not exactly a Hillary Clinton fan, are you?
No, and I'll tell you, I'm less of a fan of hers today because, as first-time viewers might not realize, I'm an editorial writer and a columnist at the Dallas Morning News, and I was the one who had to sit here till very late in the evening last night rewriting our editorial after Hillary's surprise victory. I am not a Democrat. I'm a conservative and a Republican, but I'm an Obama fan. I really like Obama personally. I'm as inspired by him as most people are. I just don't happen to agree with his policies. And I was hoping that Obama could finally finish off the Clintons in New Hampshire. Didn't happen.
Well, this is the thing that I find so fascinating about this. And by the way, just a funny story that I heard on NPR on the way here. Apparently, Irish bookies, went ahead and already paid out those who had bet that Obama not just would win New Hampshire, but would become the Democratic nominee. They went ahead and already paid them out, which that's just the craziest thing I've ever heard. But I mean, it has a lot to do with the hype that's built around Obama. But this is what's fascinating to me because, you look at, obviously, you're a Republican, but when you look at Obama and Clinton, I would imagine that politically speaking, with regard to policy, both domestic and foreign policy, you would have a lot more in common with Clinton than you would have with Obama. And yet, like a lot of Americans, there is this sort of visceral hatred for this woman that I think is blinding people towards, whether she would be a good commander-in-chief or not. And on the flip side, with Obama, who essentially, he's inspirational. Yes, of course, he's a great talker, but who's done really nothing. I mean, he's been in the Senate for 2 years, and in those 2 years has done nothing, and has, to me, is the most Carter-like candidate I've ever seen. I mean, really, it's Carter Redux. I'm coming in to sweep away the old and bring in the new, and the thing about Obama is that I think that he's honest. I think he's serious when he talks about what he wants and how he's going about this. It's not a show, but Carter was honest too. Yeah. And we found out what happens when you have a man of impeccable integrity in the office of president. It doesn't really work.
Well, it's funny you bring up the Carter comparison. I hadn't thought about that. I was thinking last night about Obama in terms of Ronald Reagan and John F. Kennedy. Were he to get the office, would he turn out to be a Reagan, a real transformational figure who was charismatic, yes, but used his charisma to sell a set of policies and ideology that fundamentally transformed American politics until 2006, I think you can say, because even Bill Clinton was a reaction to Reaganism. Or would he be more like JFK, someone who was admired and loved for his inspirational style, but was a pretty standard-issue Democrat? And there you have Jimmy Carter, which you just brought up, and I hadn't even thought of that, who was not in no way a stylish, dashing figure like JFK, but he was a reaction to people's disgust with the Republicans and with the whole corruption in Washington. And I should say that for myself, as I said, I'm a conservative Republican, but one reason I love Obama is because he is so dramatically different. And I think I should probably be careful what I wish for, because I think that because he is more to the left of Hillary Clinton, if he was to get into the White House, he's so charismatic that he might well be able to sell liberalism in a way that someone like Hillary Clinton or less charismatic figures, and really I think all the Democrats are less charismatic than Obama, more successfully than they could do. So we might really see, with an Obama presidency, a radical shift in American politics, and not one in the conservatives' favor. I will say one more thing about Obama, though. I think one reason a lot of conservatives like him is because however liberal he is, he promises change on one big issue, and that's race. The race conversation. in this country. I remember watching the Democratic Convention in 2004, and you could not have seen a greater contrast in the styles and the substance between Al Sharpton's speech, which was all backward-looking, forever Selma, and Barack Obama, who seemed to acknowledge that there had been progress and that our destinies, Black America, white America, and all Americans who aren't African American, of course, our destinies are entwined and we can make progress together. It was the kind of rhetoric that we are not used to hearing from African American leaders, and I think the one great hope that many of us on the right would have is not that the race question goes away, although surely some on the right would like to see that happen, but that we can talk about it in a different way. We're not held hostage to Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and the politics of white guilt and victimization.
See, and maybe I'm just a little conspiracy-minded when it comes to you Republicans, but, all I ever hear is about how Republicans love Obama, and, oh my goodness, how are we going to beat Obama? And, geez, what happens if Obama becomes, the nominee? He's so difficult to beat, which I personally think is bull. Look, I can't think of a Republican nominee who can't beat Obama, with the possible exception of maybe Huckabee. Giuliani, easy. He'll just start screaming and yelling about how, the Muslims are coming to kill us, and, Obama.
Barack Hussein Obama.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe he's part of this sleeper cell, in this country. McCain will just start screaming about, we're in the middle of a war. You want to hand the reins of a war to a kid? That's going to work. Romney, he'll do the little wink and a smile about how, do we really want a black guy in this office? Really? Okay, so you get 100,000 people at an Obama rally, but when you're alone in a voting booth, are you really going to pull the lever for a black guy? Really, Huckabee, okay, so he'll have the evangelical vote, but, he's the only one who has essentially the same amount of policy experience, although I'm pretty sure Obama knows where Iran is. But nevertheless, I think it's all a ploy. I think this sort of pro-Obama stance amongst Republicans and conservatives is a ploy to get him nominated.
too clever by half. I think you're wrong. I think that actually Huckabee's probably the only Republican who could stand up against Obama under normal circumstances. And I have to say that I think that about the middle of this year, after the surge has washed away, I suspect we're going to see more violence in Iraq, and John McCain's will stay there 100 years if we have to. It's going to look pretty bad, and Obama or Hillary, whoever the Democratic nominee is going to be in a lot stronger position vis-a-vis Iraq and foreign policy. And I think also it's pretty clear the economy is going to be in much worse trouble as the year goes on than it is right now. And that's the sort of thing that not only favors the Democrats, but it favors Mike Huckabee, who is the only Republican, who is remotely as charismatic as Obama, who can talk to normal people and who seems optimistic and wanting to get beyond the old politics of partisanship. And Huckabee's also the only Republican who is speaking to the concerns, the economic concerns and the social anxieties of middle to lower middle and working class Republicans. And frankly, I think that an Obama-Huckabee race would be, relative to races we've seen in the past, rather uplifting. But maybe that's just wishful thinking. I just don't see that any Republican is going to stand a ghost of a chance against Obama. Hillary, on the other hand, look how high her negatives are. She is so loathed by so many Americans that people like me who are disaffected Republicans who hadn't even planned to vote this fall, if Hillary is the nominee, I guarantee I'm going to come out and vote whoever the Republican is, even if I have to hold my nose and vote for a warmonger like John McCain.
This is the thing that I don't sort of get. Hillary's negative numbers are 45, whatever, but they will never ever be more than 45. There's nothing we don't know about Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. What we do know about her is that she has a remarkable knack to get her political enemies to join her side, and what she's done in New York, I think it's a perfect example of this. I also think that while over the last couple of months, probably because of the surge, or maybe because it's just sort of dropped out of the media cycle. Iraq and Afghanistan and the larger, so-called war on terror has really dropped out of people's minds, and people are focusing on much more domestic issues. And frankly, at this point, it's every election cycle is the same: change, without recognizing that, by the way, change is just a word, a word that everybody uses. It's just sort of, how do you use it? Do you use it better than your opponent? And Obama certainly does use it better than his opponent, but he's never bothered to actually define what he means by change. He just says it better. I really think that Hillary, look, this isn't we treat it like a popularity contest. It's true, and I do have this fear that we are about to have a 2000 redux, where it's, instead of voting for the most competent person to become president, we're just going to vote for the guy that we like the most.
Well, when have we ever voted for the most competent person?
All right, yeah, I mean, it's true. But we are, I think, one thing that I do agree with John McCain is that we're in a pivotal moment in American history, and it's going to require an enormous amount of knowledge, skill, political skill, and political skill, requires playing the game, knowing how to play the game, in order to bring us out of this. I mean, I just wrote a piece for Foreign Policy talking about the fact that our image in the Muslim world is so bad that when I was in Iran not too long ago, I was talking to a bunch of kids there, some 17-year-old kids, and one of them found out I was living in America. She asked me what it's like to live in a theocracy. Now, here's the point that I was trying to make in that piece. When a girl living in the only country in the world in which the religious authorities are also the political authorities thinks that America is a theocracy, we've lost. Simple as that. And so it's going to take more than just sort of a good image, a rebranding, as Andrew Sullivan says, in order to fix that. It's going to take an enormous amount of, backdoor dealing, wheeling and dealing, and all the things that I think, a professional politician like a McCain or a Clinton is good at doing. And then also the other thing, too, is I'm not worried about, Hillary's... I mean, I'd be happy with Hillary or Obama. But I'm not worried about this idea of Hillary's unelectability because, this isn't a democracy. It's a republic. And all she has to do is win every state that carry one of the worst Democratic nominees in recent history, plus one state. And I don't see how that's a problem for her at all.
But then, Reza, she has to govern the country after she wins. And this is, Hillary has the knack, for better or for worse, for bringing out the absolute worst aspects of the right. And I got to tell you, it's just so depressing to me to think that we might have 4 more years of what we've had from the Republican side and the Democratic side, for the past 10 or more. It's just, I find that prospect deeply depressing. And I credit your insight that she probably has more policy expertise than Obama. But, when you talk about a professional politician, Obama has been a politician for quite some time. In fact, he got elected to city council in Chicago. He's done community organizing. I don't see why that is less relevant experience than Hillary Clinton has, having been the first lady. And I think this is this weird double standard of expertise that you certainly see on the Republican side, with a lot of the GOP establishment trying to put down the experience of Mike Huckabee, for example. It really bothers me to see that a lot of the things that the GOP establishment, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the conservative intelligentsia, the things they fault Mike Huckabee on, inexperience on foreign policy, that's being the biggest one, they completely overlooked in George W. Bush, and the religiosity. George W. Bush was every bit as religious and conversant with religious conservatives as Mike Huckabee is, even though Huckabee's a pastor. Yet somehow that's a big offense to the Wall Street Journal editorial page and these guys, but it was okay with Bush. I think what really upsets them, the establishment Republicans, is Huckabee is talking bad about Wall Street. And I don't think Huckabee is nearly as much of a threat to Wall Street interest as his rhetoric indicates. But it's very telling to me that as long as George W. Bush could be relied on to be a good, faithful servant on Wall Street, they could put up with his religious stuff. Huckabee is more of an economic populist, which, by the way, is where most Republican voters are, according to the 2005 Pew Political Typology Survey. They're social conservatives, and they're more moderate on the role of government and on economic policy. Huckabee, I think, is hitting a sweet spot right now, and the fact that the Wall Street Journal and others are howling about it tells me how out of touch they are with where the American people are right now.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, and I do agree with you about the fact that it's Huckabee's economic policy that it has brought about the ire of the Republican establishment, no question. But I do think that there's a very important difference is that most Republicans realized the mistake that they made in looking at somebody who was as inexperienced and frankly incompetent, especially when it came to foreign affairs, as a George W. Bush, and they don't want to make that mistake again. I think that has a huge role to play with it in it. And by the way, that message is working wonders for Hillary. I mean, everyone's saying, "Oh, she won because she teared up." I think she won because she started saying to people, "Look, we did the whole I want to have a beer with my president thing. We did that. Do we want to do that again?" And I think that really scared the crap out of people when they really started to think about what's going on.
Yeah, I noticed when I was watching the debate when she said that, I thought that was a great line and a great point. But the one thing wrong with what you just said about the Republicans, though, is that these establishment Republicans aren't coming out and saying that we did the wrong thing with Bush, and they still believe in the Iraq War. And also, you have to stop and think the last Republican foreign policy expert president we had prior to coming to office was George Bush the father, and who was thought to be real milquetoast by a lot of the Republican base. Governor Reagan didn't have any prior foreign policy experience. He didn't do too bad. Jimmy Carter didn't. He didn't do as well. It's very hard to find American presidents who had any kind of extensive foreign policy experience prior to coming to office. Bill Clinton certainly didn't, and I don't think he did too bad.
But you will grant that we're in a unique situation right now. And again, I do recognize that the whole war has kind of dropped off the radar for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you that that's going to change, and it's going to change dramatically, quite soon, certainly before the elections. Yeah. But I mean, as somebody who's traveled, the region since September 11th and spoken to a lot of people, I mean, we're in a situation that could very well be, the beginning of the end of the American imperium, and. Mm-hmm. This is not a moment in which I think we need to start thinking about the presidency as it has been. You're right, as it has been for generations, as sort of a popularity contest, who we want to hang out with and who we just sort of intuitively trust. If this were 2000, yeah, bring on Huckabee and Obama. But I just feel like we're in a do or die situation now that is actually, I have to say, much, much graver than even those people who are paying attention to it think it is.
Well, I'd like to know more of your thoughts about that and what you think we need to do to pull out of it. Because I do agree with you that we're in a very bad situation, but I don't see enough imaginative thinking on either the Democratic or the Republican side to show the way forward out of this mess.
Well, on the Republican side, and I know that you're a bit of a Huckabee fan. On the Republican side, for me, I've noticed sort of it's the foreign policy is a one-trick pony, jihadism, or to paraphrase Rudy Giuliani's stump speech, they're coming to eat your babies. But
if you don't vote Giuliani, the terrorists will have won. That was his last commercial.
Right, exactly. And on the one hand, you can laugh about it, and it is a joke the way that it is being discussed. And yet, if the war on terror is a war of ideology, a war of ideas, a marketing campaign, I can't imagine that there's any rational human being who thinks we're actually winning this thing. I mean, the ideology of jihadism, which is a transnational phenomenon, it's a social movement much more than it is a religious movement. It has very little in common with national terrorist / resistance movements in, say, Lebanon or in Palestine or in Chechnya or in Kashmir. It has really no kind of political, goals or agendas other than this kind of cosmic war agenda that it has, and that we have quite freely joined, which is why I'm kind of afraid of a Huckabee candidacy, because I think that, in a war of ideas, rhetoric, your words become your greatest tools, and I think Huckabee is just going to go right to the Bible for his talking points.
Unlike the guy we have now, of course.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So, I think that when you travel around not just the Middle East, but Europe, Latin America, Western Europe, our allies, people who should be on our side, in other words, in this ideological conflict, and find that they think that the greatest threat, to peace, the greatest threat to them, their own security, is not, the crazies, but us, then, to actually deal with that problem requires not just a new way of thinking, a new way of doing government, a new image to the Middle East. It requires sitting down with relevant parties, knowing, who is involved, where interests lie, the incredible complications, the complex dance, particularly in the Middle East. It requires actually being able to, pronounce the name of the president of the Palestinian Authority and the Prime Minister of Israel, which we now know Bush cannot do. These may seem like silly things, and I know that it's sort of not in our heads right now, but we're, I think, in a situation now, and unlike you, I know that you believe that the threat is also domestic, and we can certainly talk about that, because I absolutely disagree with you on that. But there is a threat out there, and it's not necessarily a military threat. It's an ideological threat, and to deal with that ideological threat, which is an internal conflict, I think requires a level of expertise that in previous elections may, with regard to foreign policy, that in previous elections may not have been nearly as important. You gather some knowledgeable people around you, you put together a policy, and you just sort of learn on the fly. Right. Well, the days of learning on the fly are over. We're in a dire situation, and for me, that's why. I really honestly do hope it becomes a McCain-Hillary campaign. I'm not sure, how that would turn out. But
again, I just don't understand why. I can understand, of course, somebody like Governor Huckabee not rating high on this issue, because he doesn't. But McCain's certainly got the experience. He's been there long enough. But I think his ideas are bad about the war and backing the war. And I just don't see where Hillary is terribly different. And you look at expertise. George Bush obviously couldn't find his way outside of the state of Texas when he took office, but he surrounded himself with all these Republican wise men. It had a tremendous amount of expertise, and they were very, very wrong, as it turned out, about how to run the world. So I distrust the idea of that expertise is going to fix everything. Plus,
not expertise in and of itself. Of course, it's true that he surrounded himself with wise men, but wise men who sort of saw the world in the same Manichaean way that he saw the world. So, I think that's important to say. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
But no, I think that this is something that has eluded the imagination of the entire political class in this country. I think that jihadism is primarily a response to modernity. It is an expression of modernity and a response to traditional societies which see themselves being deeply undermined by the processes of modernity, which is happening all over the world. In the United States, this is something I've written about it. I get so angry at my own party and my own party's leadership on their uncritical embrace of free market capitalism, which no true social conservative can possibly be as uncritical of free market capitalism and globalization as the mainstream of the Republican Party is, because it so undermines traditional social relations, some of which may need to be undermined, but for heaven's sake, this is so traumatic to people. And, when you think about how far Saudi Arabia, for example, has come in the last 100 years, there's bound to be some pushback from that, and I think that's what we're seeing. And I don't see that the political class on either side has the faintest clue how to address that, because most Americans in the leadership level at least, seems to me, look at foreigners and see deep in their hearts a little American dying to come out. And I think that's so wrong.
Yeah, that's true. For the Blogging Head viewers, sorry I had to plug in there, and that's why I disappeared for a little while. So let's move. So you must be just devastated about the acquittal of the Holy Land Foundation. That must be really hard for you to take, right?
Well, they weren't acquitted. It was a hung jury. But yeah, I mean,
actually, no. I mean, a number of the key players were acquitted, but for the most part, it was not the result that I was hoping to see. But I think that the trial itself, its lasting value will be that it revealed that the Muslim Brotherhood is far more active in this country than people thought, and has been for a long time, and that they, as Muslims like Hussein Haqqani and Zuhdi Jasser have pointed out, these guys are, because of their money and their organizational power, are in the position to define Islam in America. And this is something that really worries me, and frankly, the news media haven't been paying nearly enough attention to it. Well, I think the news media haven't paid enough attention to it because there's nothing there to pay attention to. There's a problem with the way that you describe, and frankly, the way that Professor Haqqani describes, the quote-unquote international Muslim Brotherhood, as though any such thing exists. There is no such thing as the International Muslim Brotherhood, and trying to, in 2008, find a way to sort of draw a line between, say Hamas or other sort of branches of the Muslim Brotherhood across the world to the actual Brotherhood in Egypt is a ridiculous exercise. The Brotherhood in Egypt was a unified organization for about a decade. After that, it became an ideology, an idea that had a complete life of its own. Frankly, when you look at the actual Brotherhood, the actual Muslim Brotherhood, in its core, the Hassan al-Banna followers who are for the most part primarily just in Egypt. This is about as moderate and about as democratic as an organization, a Muslim organization in the region could get. We could only pray for Muslim brotherhoods like that to pop up all over the Middle East. It would be about the best thing that we could hope for, not just for our agenda and with regard to the larger war on terror, but for the political and economic development of the region itself. You cannot draw a straight line between radical or extremist organizations who may or may not be trying to infiltrate Muslim American organizations in the United States with the Hamas, for that matter, because both of them have, as their trunk, this organization that started 60, 70, 80 years ago. And I think that's the problem with the way that you and others talk about the Brotherhood, as though it's sort of this one cabal, this one sort of conspiracy of Islamists whose purpose is to turn the entire world into an Islamic state. That just simply doesn't exist.
But you probably read, though, about the memo, the organizational memo that was put into evidence at the trial, in which they said exactly that. What we're going to do in this country is try to set up front groups to undermine, in the long term, the country and turn it into an Islamic state. I don't think either one of us believes that's going to happen in the United States, but that was the intent of these organizers in this country, whether it was...
Yeah, it very well may have been the intent of whoever, wrote the memo or the group that memo, represents. But it's not the intent of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's not the intent of American Muslims, or for that matter, it's not the intent of the Council of American Islamic Relations, which you've discussed as a front for the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not the intent of the Islamic Society of North America. I mean, these organizations, regardless of, let's say, whether they received funds from organizations that may have had something to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, or maybe even their origins had some aspect to do with the Brotherhood, as dozens of organizations around the world have some link in some way to the original Muslim Brothers. But the fact is that all of these organizations, and indeed Muslim communities themselves, are distinctly and utterly indigenous to the population, to the countries in which they come from. The American Muslim organizations here, and I would know this because I spent a good deal of time traveling around talking to these organizations, have absolutely nothing ideologically in common whatsoever with the Brotherhood agenda of an Islamic State at all. I mean, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, who is the head of the Islamic Society of North America, and probably one of, and by the way, a white woman, and frankly, one of the most respected scholars of not just Islamic law, but of American Islam in the United States, and who runs the organization, has absolutely no, intent or idea or even, a sense of trying to create some kind of, Islamic entity in the United States. Quite the contrary. The same is true of CARE. The same is true of MPAC. The same is true of all of these organizations that are being, and by the way, the same is true of the Holy Land Foundation. All these organizations that are being, accused of having these ties to these sort of international terrorist organizations, who want to turn the world into an Islamic caliphate. That kind of argument, besides just being fear-mongering, just has absolutely no evidence behind it. An 18-page memo, found in the paperwork of the Holy Land Foundation, written by an individual who may or may not have some sort of connection to some organization that may or may not have some link to a historical Muslim Brotherhood, says nothing about what's going on in the American Muslim community. What does say something about what's going on in the American Muslim community is the fact that you have 8 to 10 million Muslims here, solidly middle class. The median income for a Muslim household in America is larger than it is for a non-Muslim household in America.
But what does that prove?
And the fact that there has been absolutely not a single case of an American Muslim taking part in any kind of domestic terrorist attack. I mean, or planning for a domestic terrorist attack. Every single trial, every single accusation that the government has brought has either completely disintegrated, or it has been, a case of a group that has absolutely nothing to do with the American Muslim community, like the poor dudes in Queens, of the Temple of Solomon guys who, were called Muslims, Muslims who want to destroy, the Sears Tower. These things, it's an absolute joke.
Well, I see we're running out of time here, so I want to get something in before we have to go. I hear what you're saying, and I think that one thing that makes it so difficult to determine what is truth and what is not is the very defensive and accusatory tone that some of these groups take when you make inquiries of them. I remember when I was first here at the Dallas Morning News editorial board, we had the then head of ISNA, Dr. Syed Saeed. He came by for a visit just to talk with the board, and I had done some research on him, and I found that members of the ISNA board had some pretty solid links to having expressed or links to extremist views. And I asked him just a very ordinary question, like, how do you justify your rhetoric, Dr. Saeed, about peace and understanding, which sounds great, with the fact that, and I went over some quotes attributed to members of his board, rather than answer the question, he got so furious he shook his fist at me, literally shook his fist at me, and said that this Inquisition reminds him of Nazi Germany, and that I must repent of what I said. I said, sir, I'm just asking you a question. And he never did answer it. He just acted offended. And this is the MO time and time again, Reza, that I run into as a journalist and here at the newspaper and elsewhere. I put a transcript up on the Dallas Morning News editorial board blog of an hour-long meeting we had with the former head of CARE here in North Texas and other members of the Muslim community, where I asked them 5 or 6 times directly, simple question, do you support Sharia in the United States? And we got these very long-winded and evasive and accusatory answers. How dare you ask that? Just answer the simple question. And there were members of our editorial board who went in there who think that I have a chip on my shoulder about Islam because I was downtown New York on 9/11, blah, blah, blah. And they went in there favorably disposed to the local Muslims, but the local Muslims were so evasive and angry that anybody would even question them. In the same way we question Christians and secular people and Jews.
No, it's not the same way. No, it's not the same way we question Christians and Jews, because Christians and Jews are not under a microscope. Look, you do have a chip on your shoulder because of that, and I've read your writings. I mean, you've said, essentially that, look, it's true that there are some relatively peaceful Muslims who may wish us no harm, maybe the Sufis in Turkey, but, that very many Muslims, despise non-Muslims. I'm sorry, but that kind of rhetoric, coupled by questions of, look, do you want Sharia in America? What are your plans? Makes people very nervous and it would be perfectly natural for them to launch back at who the hell do you think you are and get out of my face kind of a thing. And look, by the way, I do want to say that there's a reason why those organizations have been wiped clean. I mean, I will say this very clearly, that before, September 11th, and this is true, I think, of organizations, not just in America, but organizations throughout Western Europe, because I've done a lot of studies about, pre-9/11 and post-9/11 Muslim organizations. It is true that, pre-9/11, a lot of these groups were led by older, people, primarily people from, Pakistan, from South Asia, people who came here and whose idea of, an Islamic organization in the United States or in Europe was essentially to mimic whatever that organization would be, both culturally and ethnically as well as religiously in their home countries. But the fact is that is no longer the case. In the same way that 9/11 essentially has, focused the minds and the energies of Americans in general, it has done the same thing to Muslims in general. I mean, it's really forced, I think, American Islam to begin to define itself as distinctly American and distinctly Muslim. But conversations that you had after September 11 with some guy who runs a CARE in Texas is by no means indicative of what is taking place here, or this idea that there's some sort of sleeper cell is basically what you're referring to, of Muslims who are essentially biding their time until they can turn this country into some sort of Sharia-dominated caliphate.
Well, I have to tell you, Reza, there was a lot of evidence presented at the Holy Land trial that indicated that sort of thing. And the thing you quoted me on saying before, I don't know what the date was of that quote, but I will say I have revised my opinion since right after September 11th and said some things back then in the immediate aftermath that I regretted. And as I've learned a lot more about American Islam, my opinion has changed. But I still maintain that it is difficult to report and to comment on Islam in America because there is such a defensiveness. It's the same kind of defensiveness that you used to get from Catholics, from the Catholic Church, whenever reporters would try to talk about the pre-sex abuse scandal or other things like that. It would be like, why are you attacking Catholics? Why do you hate Catholics? Why do you hate the Catholic Church? And well, no, not necessarily. It's whatever one's personal feelings about Catholicism or Islam or whatever is, if there are legitimate journalistic questions to be asked, then they have a responsibility to answer them. And believe me, I've sat in on meetings with Catholics and with members of Jewish organizations where we put pretty tough questions to them about, their policies, and certainly the Jewish organizations, more so with Israel. And they don't necessarily like these questions, but they don't. Their immediate fallback is not, "Why are you so bigoted?" And
yeah, actually, you should have tried asking those questions of those Jews in 1950, and I'm sure it would have been quite a different response. Look, the fact is that there are countless, not just Ingrid Mattson, as I was saying, but Ahmed Yunus and Salam Mariyati and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. These are the true national leaders of American Islam, and every 10 minutes, I mean, maybe it's just me and I watch too much news, but it seems like every 10 minutes, one or another of them is on some cable news program, talking about Islam answering these kinds of questions. So, I understand that you have this experience, this personal experience, and maybe it says something about the Muslim community in Dallas. I don't know. To be perfectly honest with you, I'm not familiar with the
it's a rather
community
large
over there.
Community, actually.
But I mean, I've been to Houston a few times, but never Dallas. But I think that the way to sort of judge the community here is by its actions, and I think its actions are utterly and absolutely clear. And in fact, as part of the Department of Homeland Security response team, I'm in constant contact with DHS, and I can tell you that the quote unquote radicalization project that DHS began running in 2001, 2002 has more or less, it hasn't shut down, but it has become irrelevant because there is no radicalization in America of Muslims. And talking about, the 17-year-old Muslim kid, or 18-year-old Muslim kid in Dallas who supports suicide bombing says nothing at all. I mean, I think you mentioned that that's sort of sedition on I think in one of your writings, but that says nothing at all about Muslims. What it says is about 18-year-olds. I probably would argue that a great many 18-year-olds, Muslim or not, would support suicide bombing. The same kids who wear Che Guevara shirts and who are going to vote for Obama, by the way. Those kids, are kids, and this is what kids do. You can't. I have a real problem with journalists who forget about the fact that human beings have multiple identities. And so, for instance, if a father kills his daughter, because she's, whatever, she's not following his rules, or she's has a boyfriend, or whatever the case may be. Yeah. If a father kills her daughter, if he's white, it's a father who killed his daughter. If he's Muslim, it's an honor killing?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, as you know, there was a case right here in North Texas last week. 2 Muslim teenage girls were found shot dead in their father's cab. The father's missing. Police are looking for him as the only suspect in the murders. He was known to have been furious with his daughters for dating. He's an Egyptian immigrant. The daughters are raised here and completely Americanized. His son has said this was not an honor killing. The daughter's aunt said it was an honor killing, but we're not really going to know for sure until and unless they catch him. The thing, though, that makes that important to me is what kind of cultural environment was this guy raised in, and this guy living in. At the mosque, they had the Dallas Central Mosque. They had a funeral for them. I talked to the reporter who was there, and she said that the imam talked about, well, everybody's going to die one day anyway, and he said the important thing to do in Islam is to remember you have strong families. Strengthening the family is the most important thing. And I asked the reporter, I said, well, was there any talk about domestic violence or anything like that? She said, no, there was not at all. And, as you know, this is the sort of argument you get from those who defend violence against women, even up to honor killing, as a way of social control. We've had this has been the same thing in Jordan.
Yeah, you know what else it is, Rod?
What?
It's the kind of arguments you get from people at funerals. Look, if this man just happened to be Christian, and I don't mean like a real hardcore evangelical, but just whatever. Like he went to church once in a while, and he killed his daughters. At the funeral, the pastor or, the guy that the family paid $400 to in order to give the sermon would say the exact same thing. That, God, he went to God or she went to God and, everybody's got to go sometime and the Lord will protect them and the family is the important thing. And nobody would bat an eye. The mistake that you're making is the mistake of singular identity, singular affiliation. It's this idea that if an action if an action happens, and that action happens to, be by somebody whose religious affiliation is Islam, then it's the religion that has, that is the primary factor in that action. But we are people of multiple identities. We are we have cultural identities, ethnic identities, religious identities. We have gender identities. We have political identities. And all of these things play a role in every action that we do. Every action. And so the fact that, a man kills his daughters because, it violates some sense of his identity of what they should and should not be doing, makes him a bad man. It doesn't make him a bad Muslim. It makes him a bad man. It doesn't make him a bad Egyptian. It doesn't make him a bad, it doesn't make him a misogynist. It just makes him a bad man.
We have to be careful, Reza, not to completely push away any cultural, including religious factors that might have put him in that frame of mind. I mean, whenever there's, like, say, an abortion clinic shooting, when we used to have those, I think it matters whether the person was engaged in very devoted to his religion. I don't think it means all Catholics or all Christians are therefore, possible abortion clinic murderers. But as a Christian, it bothers me to think that Christian faith will be upheld in a case like that. I think it's important to consider, although not, as you say, necessarily determinative. I think it would be quite wrong to say that all Muslim men are, wife beaters or so on and so forth. Clearly that's not the case. But I think it's important just to ask the questions, like certainly in our local case, well, what played into this? What role did religion play or not play in the actions this man took?
Sure, but see, you're saying that I'm pushing, one of these identities away. Far from it. What I am saying is that rather than focus on one of these multiple identities, you have to think of all of them at once. So if you're going to say, for instance, what role did religion play in this? Then you have to also say, what role did ethnicity play in this? What role did culture play in this? What role did gender play in this? What role did politics play in this? Because all of those things, every aspect of a human being's identity, the sum of all of those parts is what determines what we do and what we don't do. When you call a murder like this, not a murder, but an honor killing, you do so for a very specific reason, Rod. You do so that the sole focus on the murder is brought upon the man's religion and nothing more. There's a reason why you use that term. Why are you using the term?
Well, I'm using the term because the facts in this case, as we know them, and again, we don't know for sure this was an honor killing or not. The facts as we know them, though, indicate that this man, if he killed his daughters, that they fit a pattern of male relatives taking it upon themselves to commit violence, even murderous violence, against female relatives for having violated taboos, usually sexual taboos. These girls here in Texas, their friends told the media that they were scared of their father because he was mad at them for having boyfriends. Just today, I saw on the news in Jordan, the police have arrested a man and charged him in an honor killing of his 30-year-old daughter who was dating, and he reportedly confessed to the police that he had, quote, cleansed the family's honor. And there are human rights activists in Jordan, Muslim human rights activists, women, saying that there's no political will to fight this sort of thing because it's so culturally entrenched in Jordanian society that this is acceptable when women cross that line and transgress. Now, it's clear, too, to anybody who investigates the honor-killing phenomenon, it is not limited to Islam. It is in other societies, too, especially Mediterranean societies. In Sicily and Italy, they were big for a while. But in Jordan, some of the more conservative parties have used Islam to justify it. And I think it's important to, as we report on it and comment on it, to separate what Islam actually teaches, or the various schools of Islam teach, from what are just cultural traditions.
But I don't think you're doing that, and I don't think you have any interest in doing anything like that. You bring up the abortion bomber. I think you're wrong. It's very, very rare that the abortion bomber's religion becomes his primary identity. It's actually quite often that his sort of cultural and political surroundings is what people focus on.
When serious? Do you remember the way they went after Cardinal O'Connor back when the guy Salvi in Massachusetts? I think this was in the 90s.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about the last case, which is Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph was a member of a Christian supremacist organization. Mm-hmm. He did what he did because he thought Jesus would want him to do it. Mm-hmm. Now that's ridiculous, but it was never a part of the dialogue about Eric Rudolph. It was his white supremacist political affiliations. That's what people talked about, because people understood that there are multiple identities in a person, and just because this one Christian blew up, let's say, the Oklahoma City Federal Building, Timothy McVeigh was a member of a radical Christian sect. No one talks about Timothy McVeigh as a religious terrorist, which is exactly what he was, a religious terrorist. But it's not spoken of in that way, because people in America, you have 100 million evangelicals. 80% of the country 78% of the country calls itself Christian. And of course we know that, Christian values in no way, shape, or form promote, the killing of innocent people. But if the person is Muslim, and because Islam is a minority religion here, and because this country is caught in this lunatic, ridiculous and absurd clash of civilizations mentality, which I know you're a big fan of, but which is not just silly, but one of the downright stupidest theories I've ever heard in my entire life.
Funny, Fuad Ajami just said Huntington was right. Did you see that?
Fuad Ajami is Huntington. Fuad Ajami is the only brown Orientalist in the world. He's like the sole Arab Orientalist in the world. Look. The clash of civilizations, as Amartya Sen has noted, as Talal Assad has noted, is just stupid. The idea that there's such a thing as Hindu civilization, what the hell does that mean, Hindu civilization? What is Islamic civilization? There's no such thing as Islamic civilization. It doesn't exist. Do you mean Arab civilization, which makes up, 7% of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims? Do you mean Persian civilization, which has had probably most to do with the monarchical tradition of Islam? Are you talking about Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, which has nothing to do with anything else? Mongol civilization, which took control of the entire Muslim world for a century? Turkish civilization? No. When you say Islamic civilization, the sole purpose of that term is to differentiate it from an imaginary Western civilization, which, by the way, also doesn't exist. Civilizational identities do not exist. They exist solely to create these false categories in order to compare one thing, West, with another thing, Islam.
I don't. Too bad that we're at the end of our time, because this is really interesting. Because none of that makes sense to me at all. I guarantee. I can agree with you that the borderline between civilizations is much more porous than the sort of crude clash of civilizations model indicates. But I think there's a very different sense of what's important in life and how society should be organized from, say, if you're in Europe, or if you're in Beijing, or you're in Islamabad. And I think that religion and culture are very broadly the organizing dynamics of these different civilizations. Doesn't mean that one is worse than the other, but I think that they do.
That's exactly what Huntington's point is that Islamic civilization and Hindu civilization are on a and he also says Sikh civilization for some strange reason. And by the way, Hindu civilization, does he mean in India, the second largest Muslim country in the world? Look, the idea is that the notion, and as you say, that religion and culture plays a role in this. So by religion, I mean, I imagine what you mean is Christian, and the role that Christianity has played in Western
in general.
civilization. Except that Christianity is not a Western religion; it's a religion of the Middle East. Christian the congregations. I'm sure when people talk about Christianity as the core of Western civilization, or for that matter, the origin of modern democracy, they do not have in mind the Orthodox churches of Eastern Europe or the ancient, Christian congregations of the Middle East, even though the central doctrines of Christianity emerged there and not in Latin Christendom.
You're absolutely right about that. Couldn't agree with you more. But as I recall, Huntington identifies Orthodox civilization as being distinct from Western for various reasons. I mean, it's just Orthodox Christianity and Western Christianity. Even though in the West we rarely think about Orthodox Christianity, it is fundamentally very different. And I when I was living in Brooklyn and worshiping with Maronite Christians from Lebanon, it was fantastic to me to get to understand the differences and the similarities as well. But these were my first personal encounter with Christians from the Middle East. And I would tell my friends, I said, look, you really ought to come to church with me, because the ancestors of these folks I go to church with, they were worshiping Jesus Christ back when our Northern European ancestors were still pagans. And it's fascinating to explore those differences.
But of course, that's not what Huntington means when he says the West. He is suggesting, and this is perhaps the craziest part of his idea. He's suggesting that somehow these civilizations, Hindu civilization, Islamic civilization, and Western civilization, are somehow these monolithic things that have sort of grown up without any kind of multiple ethnic, multi quote unquote civilizational, influences, and that most importantly, that they sort of emerge without profoundly transformative interactions with and borrowings from each other. There is no part, absolutely no aspect of Western civilization has been not influenced by the civilizations of the Middle East, the multiple civilizations of the Middle East. Not a single part of it. And to imagine that you can create some imaginary thing called the West, Western civilization, and then to essentially make up other civilizations, other monolithic civilizations, like Islamic civilization or Hindu civilization or Sikh civilization, for the sole purpose, and I mean Huntington doesn't he doesn't hide his purpose here, for the sole purpose of essentially differentiating it with Western civilization. So you start with us. You create this imaginary ideal of Western civilization whose sole purpose is to create an us. And then you create an imaginary Islamic civilization whose sole purpose is to differentiate it from us. I mean, that kind of scholarship used to be thrown out of academia. And there's a reason why nobody paid any attention to Clash of Civilizations until 9/11.
Well, I got to say, I as a general matter, I don't see anything particularly wrong with cultural studies insofar as they help us understand what makes one people, a group of peoples, fundamentally different in what they believe and the way they act than another group of people. I mean, here in Texas right now, and this is something I wish we had talked about when we were talking about American politics.
Next time.
The immigration issue from Mexico looms very, very large. A lot of it for economic reasons, but chiefly, I think, for cultural reasons. There is a big culture clash going on here right now, playing out on the streets of North Texas, because we're on the front lines of the immigration from the South, this great wave of immigration coming out of Mexico. Now, there's an enormous argument, and we just got into it here at the Dallas Morning News because we named the illegal immigrant as Texan of the Year. We wrote an essay, I'm the one who wrote it actually on behalf of the board, talking about how, whether you think immigration is positive, immigration is negative, or you're down the middle, conflicted on it, there's no question that this mass migration from Latin America is changing Texas dramatically. And we've gotten changing this country rather less dramatically, but over time it will change it dramatically. And we've got to figure out how to deal with it. The people who say there's no problem at all and the people who say that the sky is falling, neither one of them are being particularly realistic about the very real cultural changes happening now. And we got completely bombarded with people from both sides who were mad at us for not taking their side in the issue. And I guess the only reason I bring that up, Reza, is just to say that I think it's just folly to say that there's no such thing as dramatic differences between cultures. I think you're no doubt right that there are people on either side of an issue, like the upper culture class issue, who want to exacerbate those differences for their own purposes. That said, I think the real challenge is to find out what we have in common and not to let our differences lead to shooting and fighting and to lead to misunderstandings that could lead to unnecessary violence. I think personally, and I may have to leave it at this, I'll give you the last word, I think that the whole Iraq debacle and the debacle of American foreign policy in the Middle East comes from a fundamental unwillingness to try to understand those countries and those societies on their own terms, and to try to impose American values on people who may not have wanted them. And I was in favor of the Iraq War at the beginning, because I bought the whole neocon line, and I was wrong. I came to see very bitterly that I was wrong. And I would like to see a foreign policy, whoever the next president is, be what George Bush promised it would be, more humble and more willing to listen to others and accommodate ourselves to them, and to realize that we're not going to remake the world in America's image, and that is an illegitimate thing to aspire to in the first place. You go ahead and have the last word.
I mean, I agree that culture is important, and I never said, the issue is with culture. And that's not at all what Huntington is talking about. If it were, he'd be talking about Arab culture or, Mongol culture or Turkish culture, and he's not. He's talking about Islamic culture, and no such thing exists. The debacle in Iraq is not because we didn't understand Islamic culture, it's because we didn't understand Arab culture. That's the problem. And I do agree that, we've got this other issue, and of course Huntington's second book, Who We Are, or Who Are We, or whatever it was called, was just as idiotic about so-called American and Mexican culture as it was about, his imaginary monolithic civilizational clash. But my question to you is this. You're saying that there is a sort of a culture, and we're going to have to leave it at this. So my question to the Bloggingheads audience is this. What is American culture? And how is Mexican culture somehow, in conflict with American culture? What is, because they don't speak English yet? Because what? They're Christians. They believe in democracy. They believe in the Protestant work ethic for sure. What is it that this clash is about? And is there what's such thing? Is there such a thing as some kind of cultural homogeneity in America? We're the only country in the world that has no such thing and has never had any such thing as ethnic or cultural homogeneity. America is what Americans say it is. And if in 20 years we have 50 million more Mexicans in this country, America is still America. It just changes, as it's always changed. It changed after the massive Catholic migration, after the massive Jewish migration, now after the massive Muslim migration, and after the massive Mexican migration. There is no cultural clash in America because there is no American culture. Well,
on that happy note, let's say goodbye. Well, this has been vigorous and it's been fun, and I hope we get to do it again sometime.
I hope so too. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.